thank you very much, Linda. I want to thank you guys for coming. We have a very exciting presentation here for you guys today. It is very important that we capture our World Heritage Sites. The technologies that we have today are incredible, and they're fundamental on really preserving the past. And as you're going to hear from Lon with his work with UNESCO, they have captured some of the most important sites around the world before they've been destroyed, whether by natural disaster, wars, terrorism, you name it. And it's very important that we capture these. We need these for our future generations so that they can know that these sites existed. And it's a very, very sad conversation to have that, we are losing a lot of these sites around the world, but to preserve them and to be able to give people these kind of interactions in virtual and augmented reality is of the utmost importance. And with that said, I'd like to welcome Lon Edison to the stage for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So I want to talk a little bit about preserving the past, and I'm going to quickly go through a lot of big overview concepts and ideas, and maybe it'll trigger some of the discussions. My work is, ranged from locally to internationally. I'm going to try and give you sort of the global picture of what is heritage, why is it at risk, and why and how should we use virtual and augmented technologies in its preservation. So I'll go through quickly. I know Michael might jump in. That's fine, and ask questions as we go. So roughly 30 years ago, the VR world, at least as I view it, came into being, and reality technologies, and really 3D reality technologies, I think of VR as just one piece in a three-step chain of capture, compute, create, or capture, compute, see. And they're all interlinked, and we need all of them together, and all of them are roughly 30 years old in their present form, and I think that's crucial, so you'll get snippets of that as I go through these slides. I also want to talk about what is heritage. What does the word heritage mean? Why is it important? And what is the reality on the ground? We have virtual realities, but the physical reality on the ground is pretty bleak in many parts of the world. And I'll give you that global perspective, and then Leslie, I think, will come in and really give you the California perspective and what's happening here. So, 1872. World's first national park was created at Yellowstone in the U.S. There had been parks around the world. There were royal preserves belonging to kings and others, but the concept of a national park really began here. It's an American invention in 1872. Remember that date. That's important. 1945, UNESCO came into being in the aftermath of World War II, and in this phrase from its charter, the idea was that if we're going to build peace, we have to do it in our minds and through education and knowledge. In 1959, UNESCO got, in many ways, one of its most important projects. UNESCO Heritage is a very small part of UNESCO's mission, only 1% of its budget, but it's perhaps its most visible. And in 1950s, Egypt decided to build the Aswan High Dam, and that would inundate the temples of Philae and Abu Simbel. And UNESCO and the countries of the world came together. Probably no one in the audience is quite old enough, but National Geographic passed around boxes, and school children in the US collected pennies. And all of this money went into this campaign to move these temples that the waters were rising and were going to vanish from our history. We wouldn't do it today the same way we did it in 1959, but the temples were cut and they were moved to a new site. They were moved up in the desert. They're fantastic to visit them. That's the Abu Simbel on the right. That mountain is actually a fiberglass and steel structure, a hill. You can go inside. It's a giant stadium. The temple is all the original rock and everything that was moved up the hill. So So 1872, 1945, 1959, the first big international heritage preservation effort happened. 1965, discussions at the White House about building a World Heritage Trust, a trust to save the past. So a couple of interesting folks in the U.S. Were one of the founders of the World Wildlife Fund, early director of the EPA, Judge Russell Train, brought together a group of folks to talk about what he was seeing around the world. He was a big game hunter, in fact, but in Africa, places were disappearing, both natural and cultural. And so this idea, these discussions began. Those discussions moved to Paris and the UN, and in 1972, 100 years after Yellowstone, World Heritage was created under the UN as an international convention, or what we would call a treaty. And it today protects places around the world, the wildlife sanctuary in India, Ginkakuji in Kyoto in Japan, the Sundarbans in Bangladesh, Borobudur in Indonesia. Wonderful sites, but you know, there are quite a few on the list. In fact, really too many to manage at this point, but it's, you know, just over 1,000 sites. And there are many, many more places that are very important to all of us. But the reality on the ground isn't quite as rosy. Not every place is protected like Yellowstone is. I wrote a book about it, if you're interested, Disappearing World. But, you know, it goes into some of the sites. This is the Buddhas at Bamiyan in Afghanistan. So the Taliban, in one of its first big international acts, in fact, 6 months to the day before September 11th, 2001, destroyed the Buddha at Bamiyan. So for over 1,500 years it had existed. They first tried dynamiting, then they mortared and everything else, and eventually destroyed it. Sometimes sites are on a border, as in this case, a weird little outcropping of land on the Thai-Cambodian border, and there's sort of an ongoing active war over this site being declared World Heritage. So shooting happening, periodic skirmishes, mortar mounts on the site. Chan Chan in Peru. Here the problem is just farming and irrigation. This was dry desert for thousands of years, and they built farms. And in the center is a great ancient city of maybe 100,000 people, mud brick. Well, if you water all the surrounding land in a dry desert, the building starts melting, the structures start melting away into the ground. Sometimes it's pollution. Here in Beijing, smog and acid rain are destroying many of the sites. Sometimes it's tourism, tour boats off the Belize. Tour boats, you know, once you're in international waters, you can dump your trash. So lots of big cruise ships dump their trash. Most of the U.S. ones are a little better behaved now, but still lots of folks dump the trash, and this is in Belize Barrier Reef, a World Heritage Site. Mount Athos in Greece, burned. The Greek Orthodoxes, there are 13 churches there, the last of them burned a number of years ago. The caves of Lascaux, visitors brought in fungi, and they spread, and it's slow, what was called the Sistine Chapel of Prehistory is slowly disappearing. Flooding. How many have been to Venice? If you have, you may have been there on one of the, it used to be one day a year, now it's more than one day a month, where they bring out these artificial sidewalks that raise you up above the floodwaters because St. Mark's Square floods. Machu Picchu, flash flooding, over-tourism. And you know, the virtual is coming in. Lascaux, there was a $66 million physical reality replica of Lascaux built down the hill. It's just opened a couple of years ago, so that you don't go into Lascaux anymore. You can go to Lascaux, you can go to the place, but you're down the hill and you're in a giant visitor center with a replica of Lascaux. Lascaux is closed. Even as a UN official, we only, you know, once a year send someone in. So, and here, this is sort of a tragic earthquake example. So this is the site of Bam in Iran a number of years ago. it went from that to that. So world's at risk, heritage is under threat. I'm going too slowly, so I'm going to speed up. But, 30 years ago, this was that. Technology for digitizing the world. 30 years ago, we used to fly big planes, and then I had students flying kites to capture aerial views. Today, anyone can do a drone very cheaply. So an order of magnitude difference in budget. 40 years ago, a friend, Michael Neymark, did a great DARPA project in Aspen, Colorado called the Movie Map, where he filmed all of the streets with a camera and built this virtual replica. It was laughed at. It got one of those congressional awards for the biggest wastes of federal money ever. And guess what it became? Google was inspired by the idea some 30 years later and built Street View. We partnered with Google at UNESCO. We took Street View cameras all around the world to all sorts of World Heritage sites. And so they've been 2.5D digitized, not quite VR. Photogrammetry, same thing. 30 years ago, hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment. Today, you can get Autodesk 1.2 3D Catch and walk around any object and build a 3D model very quickly. I was involved in the first 3D scanning. So 25 years ago, it really didn't exist for objects and monuments. We built some of the world's first laser digitizers for sort of culture system with students on the Berkeley campus years ago. 3,000 points a second we could do with the first prototype equipment. $1 million worth of equipment. Today, $15,000. Leica has a handheld system, 300,000 points a second. So orders of magnitude faster. Same thing with location. This is a project we did in Peru. Shavinda Wantar, my colleague Maurizio Forte, we hired a satellite to overfly and this is only 15 years ago, to overfly to get data, exact positional data of where on the Earth we were, where we're capturing data. Today, your phone does just as good. And then in sort of the computational side, again, 30 years ago, it was Onyxes and infinite realities. How many of you used an infinite reality or infinite reality 2? That dates us pretty painfully. But again, today the compute power, the megaflops are in your handheld device are equivalent to those $1 million machines that we had in our labs. And then seeing reality, there's a virtual, at Giotto's Scrovegni Chapel in Italy, there's a room outside that Maurizio and his team at the National Research Council in Rome did, but a virtual tour. That you can go in. So that's the VR tour. 30 years ago, visualization, same thing. 17, 18 years ago, we digitized the Colosseum in Rome. Huge equipment, scanners, laborious work building models. It wasn't the days of Unity. And then very slowly creating highly accurate, but replicas. Same thing in VR at our labs in Berkeley. Division HMDs cost vast amounts of money, had great very wide field of view compared to a lot of today's devices, but very heavy. Only, I think, 300 lines of resolution. So, TV, old TV quality video. With Shar Davies, we put 0101 in SF MoMA, and that had it was more than $1 million of equipment to run a one-week museum display on Osmos and FMR, 2 great sort of cultural art projects. Immersive technologies, same thing. Today, Sarah Kenderdine at EPFL now, formerly in Hong Kong, has done a great sort of VR tour of the Magao caves in China, and it's immersive, and you have a tablet where you can explore it. But we were involved with the launch of the first 6-sided cave, so a room where you walk into a VR room. At VR Techno in Japan, the government of Gifu spent millions of dollars to build a cave. There's Sarah's work. Let me just quickly go forward, because I want to throw a lot of these ideas out there so we have some fodder for discussion. So 30 years ago, this didn't exist. But now we can digitize at mass scale very rapidly. All those self-driving cars are using lasers and all sorts of other stuff to capture same things in buildings. Mark Polyphes in Rome is capturing, wrote some software that can search the web and find thousands of photos, sort through those, figure out which ones are of the Colosseum. From those, he grabbed 100,000. From those, he calculated the viewpoints of those, and from those, he built a 3D model. So in fact, just everyone taking pictures of the world is digitizing it, potentially, for heritage. With all the next generation of sensors that are coming. In the museum world, all sorts of other sensors, and in the cultural world are being used. That was some of the equipment at the Louvre in the basement. So mass digitization is taking off. There's projects like this one, the Digital Life Project, where they're trying to digitize every single species on Earth. So natural heritage, not cultural, but you know, this then starts to raise for me some of the big questions. So this is all great and it's wonderful and we need everyone's help and all of the technology companies and developers, but there are big, big challenges in culture, and Leslie can really get more into some of those. But as an example, if you're going to build a VR tour or model of Venice and St. Mark's Tower, how many have been to Venice? Seen St. Mark's. So did you know, is that authentic, what you saw? You know, if I wanted to build a virtual tour of Venice, should I build it of St. Mark's Tower? So what's not really widely known by most people, and this is true of many, many heritage sites around the world, is St. Mark's Tower isn't the authentic St. Mark's Tower. It's only 100 years old, because the real one in 1902 collapsed in the ground. As you know, Venice is built on a giant former swamp and everything settling, and it collapsed. So if we build a replica of St. Mark's, do we build it of what is there today? Or do we go back to the great painter's drawings and models? Is that, if we're building a virtual tour of what life was like in 1532, should we do what's there today? Because it's not accurate. It wasn't built exactly as it was. And what about people digitizing and building models of stuff? There are many cases where I know people have digitized or made virtual tours of things, but they use a different base. So do you use St. Mark's in Venice from today? Do you use the drawings of the ancient St. Mark's? Do you use St. Mark's in Las Vegas, which, you know, if you don't have the surrounding context, it could be fine if it's for tourism. Do you use the St. Mark's in China now? So what is authentic? What is real? And so those are some of my big questions. Maybe we jump into Leslie, and then I can come back to some of these and some of the more in depth.
Yeah, so we can talk about you know, exactly what Lon was talking about 3D models, for example. And if, you know, as many of you know, if we go into Unity Store, Unreal Store, even Google Warehouse, there's probably thousands and thousands of models out there that claim to be something of something, whether it's the pyramids, or it's a heritage site, or it's just an object or an animal for that matter. And I think that brings up a very important question, is what is authentic and who owns that digital license? Who can officiate it and say, you know, this is the official model of the pyramids? And I think that's very important. Another an aspect that we can talk about is how long do these models last for? And like when me and Lon were having a discussion, we said, does this actually preserve it? Because digital information does not last very long. And, you know, as we know, and I think Lon has a slide here, you know, where our historical sites can last thousands of years, our digital information can maybe only last 100 years. And there's a lot of important conversation to how do we actually preserve this time in history, this generation. If we don't find a way to do it, everything that we're doing today in this society will not be known about. We're not really leaving that much that, you know, a society of millionaires million years ago can look back on this and say this is what they were doing in 2018. We really leave no footprint except for our highways or anything that we build in concrete for that matter.
How many of you have used Microsoft Word a decade ago and wrote a paper? Have you ever tried to reopen it? So, you know, that's a simple example. That's a text. But in culture and heritage, digital technology has huge potential. And I spent much of my life at the UN trying to get Silicon Valley and tech companies to help with these things. But part of me is always a bit torn by, does any of this really make sense? Because if we go back to my slide, it should come up.
There we go.
So, I mean, the reality is that 1,000 years from now, the pyramids will still be there. You know, the pyramids have been, they've been a construction site for years, and a lot of the facial stone has been salvaged for other structures. Lots of the mosques and palaces in Cairo are built with fragments of the pyramids, but you know, they'll still be there in some form. Sort of paper and wooden monuments, they last hundreds of years. So some of the things in the libraries, they'll still be around several hundred years from now. But what about the things that we store on an optical disc or a magnetic disc? Those are really one order, tens of years, maybe 99 years if you're really lucky, but you know, lifespan tests of CD-ROMs are 30 years, and oxidation happens to all sorts of things. Magnetic particles fall off drives. But let's talk about your models. How many of you built models in VRML? Or, you know, there's so many things that have come and gone. What are your 3D point clouds in? Are they in OBJ, which is a format from Wavefront? Who knows Wavefront? Wavefront has been long, long gone. So the encoding that we're putting, and people are doing all of this effort to digitize and work to, from the technology community, from the research community, to help folks like California State Parks, but in a way, is it all misguided? Without metadata, without a plan, without some way of preserving this, you can hand a virtual model of the pyramids or of St. Mark's over to a cultural authority. What are they going to do with it? And how will they keep that model alive so that 5 years from now someone can open it? I mean, there's a hard enough time at many museums and interpretive centers just running slideshows. I mean, Leslie, why don't you jump in and you give a perspective on this?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Here, I'll pass the mic over to you, Leslie.
Actually, I'm mic'd up. I'm good.
Some of these, but I think it's important to see some of Leslie's local examples.
So I appreciate, Lon, your years of experience in working in this area, and a little bit of a downer, I have to say. Preservation can be challenging. In California State Parks, we've got 280 parks, 1.6 million acres of land. We have 29 National Historic Landmarks that we manage, which is the same equivalent of all of the other various National Historic Landmarks in California. Over 3,000 recorded archaeological sites. That's a minuscule amount of what we actually have on the ground that we have yet to survey and map. 2,500 recorded historic buildings, many of which are on the National Register. All of these assets and millions of linear feet of archive documents that we maintain in perpetuity, and collections, millions of collections, museum objects, if you will, as well as archaeological materials. So masses of information and data that are out there. We wrestle with a couple things. There's the preservation side of it that Lon and Michael were talking about, and what we can do into the future. I don't have an answer for that yet, and I don't think any of us do, but we'll talk about that. But we also have a need to make sure that visitors are engaged with our parks. These are public lands. You pay for them as taxpayers. You help. We'd like more. We always could use more. But we're very creative, and there's a lot of people that have been doing very innovative things in parks. Lon's worked with us actually for quite a while, knows some of the earlier work that we've done, including the design work and virtual reality space that was started over 15 years ago by my colleague, Elizabeth Fraser, who's here today with me. Liz had done some virtual world creation and multiplayer early systems design. She's been our research and development R&D specialist in the department for a number of years, sort of pushing us on the, to go forward on this. connecting us in that space with an existing educational program that we had with the schools, what we call an environmental living program. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this as school kids. If you ever went to parks and you did an overnight, you might have come in and been a character, that is someone in the actual history of a historic site that you could come in at Fort Ross where Liz worked on this groundbreaking work. The students would prepare in advance, come in and play the role of the Alaska Native hunter or the local indigenous Kashaya Pomo person that was connected with the Fort Ross experience. All of this was to help pre-plan trips to engage the students in learning to go out there and physically go to the site and experience it. That was the early days, and we ended up with a final product on that with our collaboration with UC Merced. In the early days, that's still a program that continues on at that park. Decades later, students come to this location. It's remote on the Sonoma coast, so it's a little hard to reach. We were realizing that other innovators in parks in different parts of the state, because we are from north to south, east to west, we cover a large territory. Other staff were doing things like creating their own virtual tour. They might do a 360 around the Historic House Museum. You could go experience the state capitol building, interior space if you want to, in that sort of model. We weren't collaborating on a system platform, so one-offs tended to go with the employee that innovated them, right? So if you went to one historic park and that great interpreter created this wonderful thing with a very simple to use technology, when retires or moves, it's gone. A park ranger doing some great interviews of costume docents out at Marshall Gold, well, that ranger's not there anymore and that program collapses. No one wants to pay the $5,000 a year fee to the commercial company to keep that going. So what we were going to do. So about 3 years ago, the department sort of hit the wall in a number of ways. And we went back and we got support from the legislator and the governor's office to sit down and look at transforming state parks and how we were going to do that. And we looked at it across the board from accounting all the way through what we were doing with preservation, natural and cultural resources. And out of that effort came this project that really I have to give kudos to Liz Prather on for really helping connect that UC Merced World Heritage Program that had helped us out in the early days at Fort Ross. And I'd like to play you a short film to show you what we were doing to experiment in our transformation effort at Bodie State Historic Park.
Just east of the Sierra Nevada and a few miles west of the California and Nevada border stands the historic gold mining town of Bodie. This National Historic Landmark is a California state park that preserves what remains of this once thriving, diverse community. It serves as a portal to life in the late 1800s, as if captured in time for visitors from around the world to discover and explore.
National Historic Landmarks are properties that represent the national story. And so Bodie fits within that history of gold mining, coming out to the west, changing the landscape. It's just a wide expanse. It's pretty amazing, actually.
The Bodie Foundation is a key park partner, supporting efforts to preserve the town's unique character. Buildings and structures need to be maintained. Artifacts need cleaning and conservation. After more than a century, there is a constant threat of loss due to exposure to extreme weather, wildfires, vandalism, and earthquakes. These same challenges affect historic sites preserved and managed for the public in other state parks. Bodie is a testing ground for developing innovative ways to preserve these special places. UC Merced's World Heritage Program has teamed up with state parks to innovate new approaches to heritage preservation, using cutting-edge technology to digitally document artifacts, sites, buildings, and landscapes. Intricate details of Bodie are emerging as a new goldmine of information to evaluate preservation needs and priorities for these at-risk resources.
My work here is contributing to preserving Bodie for future generations, as well as to documenting Bodie for other scholars and the public.
Using sophisticated drone, airborne laser scanning, and photographic technology, Professor Nicola Lercari and his team from UC Merced are digitally recreating Bodie in 3 dimensions. Working alongside heritage preservationists, land surveyors, and drone operators, This unique group has collaborated to capture a level of detail that was previously unimaginable.
Our goal is to record very high resolution and very accurate 3D data using the laser scanner, and then produce measured drawings for Hub's preservation and documentation for different reasons. One would be for the preservation and documentation of buildings. So in case of hazards, wildfire, we'll have very accurate documentation of these buildings for the future. Another reason would be for making this data available to the public through virtual reality and augmented reality platforms, which is something, again, I've been working in the last year with a group of undergraduate students at UC Merced.
Creating these interactive experiences provides new possibilities for engagement with important cultural and historic sites. 3D technology tools like the WAVE, the Wide Area Visualization Environment on the UC Merced campus, allows users to virtually walk through a site without leaving the room. The WAVE engages younger generations, allowing them to interact with cutting-edge technologies as they explore heritage resources from around the world. An augmented reality mobile app will give park visitors the opportunity to conduct an interactive scavenger hunt by scanning objects and embedding historical information on their smartphones and tablets. This gives park visitors an important role in helping to document and preserve the park. Through the eyes and lens of the visitor, park staff will be able to see changes to buildings and landscapes, as well as track areas of high traffic to monitor maintenance needs and visitor impacts. Together with Professor Licari and the team at UC Merced, California State Parks is implementing the lessons being learned at Bodie as standards for preservation projects at historic sites throughout California. Using technology to digitally preserve these sites and make that record available for researchers, educators, and the public creates unlimited opportunities of discovery and learning. Through technology and partnership, we are creating stewards of these resources, one scan at a time.
Okay. So we took a pilot project, and you could see it's a bit of a shotgun approach. We were doing scanning on museum objects. We're looking at virtual reality, augmented reality uses. At Bodie, we are still testing augmented reality so that when the park visitor arrives at the front kiosk and they say, do you want that $1 extra brochure, multi-page brochure, with all these images in it, we can say, we can give you an added experience. You can take that brochure, and using our app that we would provide them, they can create augmented reality by looking at that historic image of the old downtown in Bodie, and then a building that's images can come up in augmented reality, and they can see the 3D scan of it. And you can look at another image, and with your own cell phone, pop up one of the artifacts that's in the building. That might be the schoolhouse. So things that you could only peer through the glass in the windows at Bodie, you can now actually have brought to you through this platform. The clip also mentioned the fact that we're doing sort of citizen science recording, so we can take people, which they currently do, they have a little trail map and they walk around and they look for a number, and it says, you're in Chinatown section of Bodie, or you're at the jail. And you can use, again, your own cell phone app that we've given you, and you can pop up that building and explore it through looking at it as a model. And you can also then be cued to take a photograph of it, and then that gets downloaded back at the visitor center. At the end of your tour, you get a little token or some reward for doing that. And that data goes into a database at UC Merced where they're processing it and looking at what's happening to the buildings over time. This became absolutely critical in our pilot project because the first year we scanned a building called the Deschambault Hotel, and it's a brick building, brick facade. Less than a year later, we had a major earthquake in Nevada. It knocked off a lot of the facade on the brick building. The second year we came back for our pilot testing, they were able to rescan it. We already had on tap to do some deferred maintenance work on the building. We sent that over to the structural engineer, the historic structural engineering firm. They recalculated, redesigned the drawings, and then we're out in the summer right now repairing that building. So this is the value of sort of the fact that we've got the data and we're connecting it directly with our engineers, architects, to take care of the maintenance on these facilities. So this is a lot of possibilities, and the question was, where do we go from here? We were testing a lot of things, as you saw, but we really need to get this out to the public, and the whole goal of this was to take the good practices that we're learning and embedding, make sure we're modernizing them at every turn, so that as the new technologies are coming, we're creating those standards that are used across all of our department, our 3,000 staff. And we're using the opportunity to reach out to the school systems. And I think that was some of the things you were asking me about is, what are we doing with the schools? We have about, I want to say, like 50 million people that access our parks regularly, you know, if you add them all up. And we've got about 50,000 school children that interact in our formal programs coming out to the parks. We also have a connection, including what do I want to call it? It's not a virtual reality in just yet, but it's a teleconferencing, video conferencing in. Okay, we have an established program of video conferencing in what we call our Parks Online Resource for Teachers and Students, PORTS program. And through that video conference network, we can now bring live broadcasts into the classroom. So rangers are now able to have their own little cart and go out and bring, even underwater diving, they can bring live broadcasts and the students can engage and ask the rangers and the interpreters questions at sites. We can take them out to the deserts, out to the coast, places the schools will never actually visit. In some cases, they're too far removed or too expensive, or we can use that engagement as a experience at the park. So we're reaching a lot of different audiences and we need to figure out how to connect the preservation aspects we're doing with both the students and the visitors in California state parks.
Fantastic. Just incredible, guys. We want to thank everybody for coming. If anybody has any last questions, let us know now.
Sorry.
If not, we thank you very much. We hope
We're
this
going
is...
to go to one last slide.
Ooh, okay, we're going to do that.
Sorry. Thank you for hanging in there.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in this discussion and want to continue it this fall in San Francisco for the first time in the US, and Leslie and Michael and Linda and lots of others are involved, the third Digital Heritage Congress, which was organized by the UN to bring many of the groups and technology companies together with cultural people. First one was in 2013 in Marseille. The second was in 2015 in Granada at the Alhambra in Spain. And the third one is coming October 26th to 30th to San Francisco with the support of UNESCO, Google, California State Parks, the Rijksmuseum, the De Young Museum, many, many European projects, many international societies. It'll be at the De Young Museum. The whole museum for a day will be just for those attending. The Jeremiah O'Brien, the last of the operational Liberty ships, will take folks out on the bay, so living history. And it'll also be at Fort Mason, but there's a whole amazing suite of panels and workshops. California State Parks is doing a series on 3D in parks. International groups, the Getty Conservation Institute has got a panel, European projects on standards for preservation and technology companies and what can be done, Google's digitization projects, lots and lots of fun things. There is a deadline for papers and workshops and proposals. It's online. The deadline is tomorrow, but it will be extended. All you need to do is just write in if you don't see a change deadline and say if you're interested in submitting and participating, and keep your eye out, and that's all I have.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys.